Good evening and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. We are going to start Chapter 3 today and talk about the causes of the Civil War. Here are your learning targets for the day. We are going to trace, not actually drawing out a picture, but showing growth of the growing conflict over the issue of slavery in the Western territories. We're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act and how those increased Northern opposition to slavery. And then finally, the landmark Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott versus Sandford. We're going to talk about that as kind of the no turning back point to the Civil War. But just to review where we've already come up to and put it in context, we've learned that the regional differences have affected this new country ever since the Revolutionary War, with the nullification crisis resulting in a sectionalism versus nationalism divide, the North being mostly a manufacturing region of the country and the South being agricultural, and of course the slavery issue. Those differences became much larger as we move through the 1800s, and they lead to an all-out civil war. The Missouri Compromise is something that is barely, if even it is, mentioned in your book, so that is why I'm going to cover it here, because it is a big step on the road to the Civil War. So Missouri applies as a slave state in 1819. Well, we need another free state to join to keep the balance between the free states and the slave states so that they both have equal say in Congress. So we have to wait until 1820, where Maine will apply as a free state in 1820. So now we have the balance. But slavery, they also add in that slavery will be prohibited in the former Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 latitude line. And let me show you a picture of that. So all the blue states are free, all the red states are slave, and the green line there is the 3630 line of latitude. And so everything north of that, slavery will be prohibited. Next up, let's talk about the Wilmot Proviso. So David Wilmot knows that we're going to get a lot of land from the Texas secession and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War. So what is going to prevent slavery from being in those states? Well, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, he says that there should be a ban of slavery in any territory gained from the Mexican-American War. And Southern leaders are outraged by this. So it doesn't get passed as a law, but it does increase slavery tensions nonetheless. And this is 1846. In 15 years, we're going to start the Civil War, so we're getting closer and closer to the boiling point. After this, a new political party called the Free Soil Party forms, and their main agenda of the Free Soil Party is to keep the soil free, prevent the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And they do nominate a major former president for president again in 1848, but they lose, and really doesn't pick up a lot of steam from there. But the Free Soil Party, we are now getting political, and political parties are forming their basis, their foundation, their platform, saying that slavery should not be in the Western territories. Now let's move on to the Compromise of 1850. We're going to come back to your learning target number 1, but let's talk about this in chronological order. The Compromise of 1850. We've got another compromise. California has to enter as a free state. They don't want slavery there. But to concede something to the southern states, because they don't have a southern state ready to come into the Union yet as a slave state, slavery will now be decided by popular sovereignty in the Western territories, which means that the voters are going to decide. They're going to put it to a vote, should we have slaves in this territory, yes or no? That's all popular sovereignty means. It's power of the people. They're also, as a part of the Compromise of 1850, going to pass a new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act. There's fugitive slave laws, but now this is a federal law that takes place all over the country. So if you are arrested for being a runaway slave, you do not get a jury trial, and you actually have to go back to the South. People can catch you and bring you back to the South. That's always been the case, but now it also forces northern citizens to capture runaways. If you knowingly aid a slave on the way to the north, you can be arrested for not capturing the runaway and reporting them and turning them back over into slavery. Now, the northern states resist this by passing what are called personal liberty laws. These, essentially, we have nullification again. They nullify the Fugitive Slave Act, and they even arrest slave catchers in the North. So this essentially undoes the Missouri Compromise because it does permit slavery in the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. They allow slavery now because of popular sovereignty. Going back to number 1, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very, very important. Author Harriet Beecher Stowe. She writes this novel to condemn slavery. Tom, the main character, basically gives Northerners a personal look at slavery. And even though it is fiction, it's a novel, it does give Northerners a view of slavery that they have never seen before. It becomes the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best book behind the Bible. And President Lincoln met Stowe at the White House during the Civil War, and he is said to have remarked, quote, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," end quote. Here are some outtakes, not outtakes, but excerpts from the novel, if you would like to read along. You can see how they feel about slavery and the laws enforcing it and what Christianity brings into this debate. And this is one of the last passages that the owner finally sees Tom die, spoiler alert, but then he is said to have freed all his slaves because Tom was such a good man. Now we have the KansasNebraska Act. I would also put this under number 1. Just jot something down. If you need to go in the margins, go for it. But these are all important steps on the way to Civil War. Stephen Douglas. He introduces new legislation for Nebraska to enter as a free state. Of course, the Southerners don't like it, so we have to rewrite the bill and divide this territory into 2 states, Kansas and Nebraska, and they decide that voters will decide the slavery issue with popular sovereignty. So people actually move to this territory. Slavery and anti-slavery supporters go to Kansas trying to outnumber the other. They both set up their own governments there. So we have a pro-slavery government and an anti-slavery government. That seems far-fetched in this day and age, but during the Civil War, a couple states will actually set up a pro-American government and a pro-Confederate government. This is where John Brown starts to make his name. He's a New York abolitionist. He takes a machete to 5 pro-slavery settlers because he does not believe in slavery. And this is so much violence here that the situation becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And eventually, after the Civil War starts, Kansas will enter as a free state on the side of the United States of America. Here is the line of Bleeding Kansas and Nebraska and Kansas. And here are all the other states that have joined the Union up to this point. During this time, the modern-day Republican Party emerges. So now we have the Democrats, which will eventually split into Northern and Southern, and we have the Republicans. They quickly become the main opposition to the Democrats, and their opposition to slavery is their main platform. and they put up a major candidate in the election of 1856, John Fremont. James Buchanan does win, but the Republican Party takes 11 northern states. They win those states, and pretty soon it's going to become all South Democrat and other slavery parties, and all North was Republican, who votes for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. But we'll get into that next time. Here's number 3, Dred Scott versus Sandford. And in 1857, this is when the case went to the Supreme Court. Dred Scott is a slave in Missouri. From 1833 to 1843, he lives in Illinois. And also, he moves to an area of the Louisiana Territory. If I remember right, I believe his master was a military man. And so they moved around a lot. And slavery is forbidden by the Compromise of 1820 in the Louisiana Territory. After coming back to Missouri, Scott sues unsuccessfully for his freedom. He says that if he lived in the free territory, that made him a free man. Then he brings a new lawsuit in federal court, and Scott's master, I believe he dies, and his wife is actually the one who they're suing, but Scott's master maintains that no pure-blooded Negro of African descent and the descendant of more slaves could be a citizen of the United States. So the question is Scott a slave? And here are the 3 things that the Supreme Court said. Slaves are property, not citizens, and therefore cannot even bring suit in a court of law. So that automatically throws this case out. Also, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness are those property rights. The government upholds these property rights of Sandford by saying that Dred Scott could not become a free man just because he travels in free states with his master and he remains a slave. Also, it goes further and says that Congress does not have the power to outlaw slavery in any territory, because if I step across this line, that doesn't mean that you can deprive me of my property without due process of law. So therefore, it says the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is unconstitutional. How did people react to this decision? The Southerners are overjoyed with this Scott decision. They don't think that the federal government is going to take away their slaves anymore. The Northerners are scared and alarmed by it, that if we can't prevent slavery in the territories, who knows where it's going to end up. So this can be viewed as the point of no return or the tipping point toward the Civil War. Just some extra stuff to kind of write down in number 1, if you have room left. The Lincoln-Douglas debates take place during this time, and this is how Abraham Lincoln makes himself a household name. Lincoln's views on slavery, we all look at Lincoln as the hero who set the slaves free, but he did not call for the immediate end of slavery or political equality for African Americans, at least in 1858. And of course, we know Douglas's view on slavery is that popular sovereignty is the answer. Let the people of the actual region vote whether they want slavery or not. And finally, we have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And John Brown, we know, is a violent man. Brown and his sons and his followers, they seize a military arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hopes to free local slaves to join this revolt, and he would revolt against the government. No slaves join, and Brown is actually captured by United States Colonel Robert E. Lee, who will become a Confederate general, but this is before the Civil War. He is put on trial for treason and murder and sentenced to death, and he's hanged. And actually, the murderer of Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, was present at the execution of John Brown. Just one of those little trivia facts. Brown is a hero or a martyr to abolitionists everywhere. This increases Northern opposition to slavery, but the South thinks that he is a fanatic. It inflames Southern anger and suspicion. And so, how are we going to view John Brown? That's one of the problems we're working on in class. So, to review, why did Southerners in Congress insist on a fugitive slave law? Why did Northerners oppose it? Southerners believed that slaves were property and that the government should defend property rights. Northerners considered slavery a great evil, and since slavery was illegal in the North, they viewed the law as an intrusion on their rights. Okay, your second review question, how did the Kansas-Nebraska Act undo the Missouri Compromise? Popular sovereignty. Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up Nebraska to popular sovereignty and the possibility of slavery, even though it was north of the line. And why was the Dred Scott decision a blow to those who opposed the extension of slavery? Because it held that the federal government cannot have the authority to ban slavery in any territory. And that's it for today. Those are basically the lead up to the Civil War, and we're going to talk about the couple years before it in the next section, and I will see you then.